Hey, welcome to the third and final segment in the Innovation Series, Dynamic Leadership Innovation Series. Today's topic is change management, although the practice is actually much more like change leadership, and probably more so today than it has ever been, at least in the US. Today I'm zooming out to look at the larger landscape, one that helps us understand why the future will not look like the past. In the first segment, I mentioned Ray Dalio's Changing World Order. An interesting thing occurs when I bring this up in conversations. In the US, the reaction tends to be one that I would expect from fans of a sports team. It's understandable. They give reasons for why China cannot replace the US in the world order. And that's understandable, as I said. However, that's not my point. The point in bringing it up, Ray Dalio's Changing World Order outlines cycles that nations go through, whether from a global view or internally. China went through centuries of dynasty changes following the same pattern. Cycles that nations go through, rising, peaking, and eventually declining. While it's easy to argue between two countries, one country replacing the other, I'd like to isolate it and just take a look at what it means for the United States. So that way we don't get caught up in the positive mental attitude, that kind of response. I have the cover of the book here. And if you look at this graph, this would be the macro cycle. And this cycle is, think of it almost like a generation. So the current world order has the US at the top, and it's basically from 1945. And he talks about it in 5 stages, and we're somewhere in here, the 5 stages, which I'll cover in a moment. And what I want to point out about this is if you just look at the US and you look at these mini cycles or the micro cycles in the context of the larger cycle, you can see this is what we've been living through. You know, you hang in there and it reverses. You hang in there, it reverses. And if you look at it from another lens, this is almost like an oscillator where it indicates when a trend shift is going to change. But if you know anything about oscillators, they can stay in that signal zone for much, much longer than you would ever expect. But something else is also true. When the microcycle trend coincides with the macrocycle trend, you can see an acceleration. And this is what I am talking about here. Now, this is not fear and all. I don't want to get into fear mongering. It's not about that. It's about looking at the world through the lens of what Jim Collins calls the Stockdale paradox. The Stockdale paradox is recognizing that facing the brutal facts that we've got some challenges ahead of us, but at the same time, knowing that we will prevail. That's that balance. It's different than just, oh, everything's going to be fine, rose-colored glasses. And it goes back to what I mentioned in an earlier talk where I said that when I used a graph and I said when we are looking at time, compared to a gap to reality, that in the near term, our plans, designs, transformations, innovations, whatever, they need to be grounded in reality. You know, the whole positive mental attitude and a lot of my other talks, the positive mental attitude and this manifestation and visualization and success principles like that, I talk about collapsing the woo-woo gap because you can't have agency if you're expecting the solution to come from out there in the universe, for example. Yes, serendipity happens. Yes, we do get some good luck here and there. And when you're working hard, you tend to get more good luck. But it's not like your working hard makes that happen. It's that internally, we start to see things that we would not have seen had we not been working hard. Now, we can argue that and debate that, but what I'm suggesting is to have agency and personal leadership, having a view that you are in control of your destiny from that perspective, is healthier than thinking that you have to do some things, have a lot of belief, and then hopefully some knight in shining armor will come along. As we get further out into the future, we're able to think in terms of the infinite possibilities. So in looking at that point through the lens of where we are here, if Ray is correct and we're in stage 5 or late stage 4 and we're somewhere in here, this decline can be very rapid, and I would suggest that we are inside that. We need to be grounded in reality, taking a look at what's really going on. That's just my point of view. I think everybody will look at this and come up with their own point of view, and that's why I'll be starting with the real world conversations about innovation and leadership starting next week, just to where we're getting grounded into reality, what's really happening. So this here is where I'm focusing on right now when we talk about change leadership. And the point is that if you had to pick one and say, is VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, going to increase over the next 2 to 3 years, or will it decrease? I think you'd have to agree that it's going to increase. If you think it's going to decrease, then maybe this is a different conversation. But that's where I'm coming from in terms of where we need to be thinking about when it comes to innovation. Something that is interesting to me is that when I look at things like people agree that 95% of people's actions are by habit. But yet, when we look at change management or change leadership, we tend to approach it from a communication standpoint. Well, if we tell them, and we tell them more often, which is helpful, right? But we lose sight of the fact that left to their own devices, people will do what they've done in the past. Under stress, even more so. And while in a stress reaction, in a survival reaction, it's almost 100% of what they've done in the past. So if we're expecting them to behave differently into the future, telling them is not enough. We have to lead by example. We have to take steps so that they actually change. And if you think about a change curve going like that, there are things you'll do in the middle, in the beginning. We talk about early adopters. In Tipping Point, use the title Mavens. These are the people who can be like influencers. And that was written before the social media influencers. They also talk about the connectors. So you're going to leverage that. From a build standpoint, I say that you start in the build. While you're building, and we talk about iterative build, while you're building, this is when you want to start introducing it to some of your early adopters so you get them talking. You create the connectors, you create the mavens, you correct the salespeople by putting it out there and letting them see it. And then you get some other things coming in with social proof. And in here is where you have that social proof is going to help. And then up here is you have the momentum. So somewhere along in here, you're going to have critical mass. And while it's not a scientific term in the context of change management, the general thinking has been somewhere around 30 to 40%. When 30 to 40% of the people agree, then this line can get steep and you can take off. The nursing comes in getting to that point and being aware that that's a process and it's not going to happen with just communication. So this is why I say change leadership is a better term than change management, because you're having to pull them along, you're having to lead by example. Another challenge that comes here is that when people are facing the unknown, there's a higher correlation to fear. That's because you're going back to the hunter-gatherer, right? The unknown presented risks. You don't know what's there. You come out to an open field or you go over a ridge, you don't know what's there. So there's going to be more fear because it's not familiar. So the unfamiliar creates anxiety. Anxiety creates more stress. The challenge is that if we are transforming means we have to go into the unknown. And this is an important point because, I like to say the same hammer that forges steel can shatter glass. And depending on how people respond to risks and danger, and that has an impact on how they respond to the change that's coming. So we have to make sure that we're aware of who's going to need some extra support in going through that process. So transformation, by definition, means we're going to go into the unknown. Transformation means designing into the field of infinite possibility. And if you're in the field of infinite possibility, again, by definition, you're talking about a lot of unknown. There's a lot of risks out there. And this is why gaps and problems, while they seem similar, so if you're talking about project management, you clearly identify the problem. That applies to clearly define the gap too, right? But I think the similarities do end. For example, if we say that down here is the problem zone, right? To get where we're in the problem zone, we want to get back up here to status quo. And up here is the gap. Well, if you just look at it in simple terms, if we have a problem, it's because for some reason we dropped below that status quo line, and now we've got to correct it. And we've seen this in organizations. The metrics don't line up, something's showing up that there's a problem. It's all hands on deck, we're going to solve this. On the other hand, the gap is something we have to design, but we don't have tapes or hooks to hang this stuff on. This creates or can create some insecurity. There's less confirmation. You're designing into this unknown zone, and it creates anxiety, it creates stress. There's I call it cognitive dissonance. In order to cross this gap, we're going to have some cognitive dissonance going on because we're doing something and we don't have the security blanket, whatever that is for you. Now, some people thrive on this. This is where they live. We talked about space designers, space fillers, and space users. Space designers are going to be more comfortable in here. Space users, all things being equal, would probably be less comfortable in there. So again, when we're innovating, we may be solving a problem, but we're solving the problem with a solution that's out into the field of infinite possibilities. And that gap is between where we are, you are here, and where we're going. The vision, the goal, or what have you. And whatever that is on the other side is going to be worth it. But going through here could be difficult. It could be starts and stops and lots of challenges. And this is why sometimes innovation projects are so difficult, because fear is constantly present because we're seeing the unknown, and the unknown can lead to fear. And then when you tap this into the habits, there's another thing that's going on. Assignments and promotions generally follow a pattern of skill match to the organization needs. So then if that's true, then those skills matched where we were before. They may not match where we're going or what we need to do. That's not a big problem. The problem is if we don't recognize it. Recognizing it and then assigning people into the right roles, giving them the support that they need. This is why I think some organizations like to hire consultants. People say, well, consultants just come and ask us questions, and then they put the answers on the slides. But the other thing that consultants are doing is they have a fresh look. They don't have the baggage. They don't have the fear of the change. They're not living with how we've always done it, and that they can see through the nuance. So I would not discount the value of having consultants come in and do that work, even though it feels like you could have said the same thing, but could you have done the same thing? If you agree that 95% of what we do is done by habit, it raises the question. The biggest obstacle to change is habit itself. That's why they say culture eats strategy for lunch. Just think about those factors when you're in the context of change management. And that's why I talk about change leadership versus change management. And then the last point is that we have to have an identity shift. What I mean by that is this is sort of a be-do-have. We have to become, when you're doing individual work, if you're playing sports, or you have to become that team that can win before you can go out and win a championship. You have to become that first. You're not going to go out and win the championships without doing the inner work. That's true for people too. It's true for organizations. We have to do the inner work and get the alignment. We have to get people working internally. And that's that identity shift. Identity works well when you're thinking about a person, but it's an organizational shift. It's a cultural shift that happens internally so that you can face what's outside. To look at that, I took this piece from Ray Dalio. By the way, the stages, the 5 stages, rise and early growth is happening in the beginning. And then we have the expansion and the buildup. The peak and maturity is in here. So we've lived that. And I know I hear millennials say the baby boomers did it, right? The baby boomers' fault. Well, we were riding this cycle. This cycle started at the end of World War II, and that's the cycle that was going on. And it's probably the buildup and expansion is why so many people were born, which led to the baby boomers. So that's not all wrong. But if you just dismiss it as the baby boomers did it, we lose sight of this cycle, which I think is important. So we have the peak and the maturity, and then we have the early decline, and this would be the beginning of stage 4, and then we have the late stage 4. And this line makes it look very steep. Some of his curves are very shallow, more like a traditional bell curve. Again, we don't know, but I will tell you that when the short-term trends and the long-term trends coincide, it's almost like climate and weather. You can almost look at it like that. And then we have the late decline, which is in here. And again, we're somewhere in late stage 4 or early stage 5. And then we have the crisis period, which is here. Organizations go through the same kind of cycle, but their crisis, they tend to restructure. They tend to go into bankruptcy. They reorganize. They get sold, whatever. They do something different to get through this crisis. But internally, as the organization, they went through a crisis. The way Ray talks about countries